The floor is open to questions. If you have comments, suggestions, anyone, you can start. Yes, sir.
This is addressed to Divya Kannan. But I have described a long history of the subaltern education system here. It was a very wonderful experience to hear you. I'm asking you, what are the still prevails, the subalternization of education, even the politics of English or the caste of English still prevails. For example, I would like to take an example from my village, where the elite teachers still gives good marks to a subaltern child who write wrong answers, or even given right chances, so that he will be beaten in the public examination. That still prevails. So my question is, how the camouflaged base of, or clandestine base of hidden casteism prevailing now? What is the way out? It is still there. It is lingering in camouflaged ways. A zebra exists in a forest because of the lions. That is why the lion exists, because of that camouflaged ways.
Any other question you want to take it to me?
Not a question. In 2019, when I wrote a small piece on who is a child, because we were working, Lena and this project we were doing in Delhi, and I thought, have we really unpacked this whole idea of who this child is we are talking about? And so I just got some work from my past, research, and I wrote a small piece. I don't know who attacked me most. My students. Ma'am, you shouldn't be doing this. I said, look, this is a category which needs to be unpacked, both in cognitive terms, in social terms, and also therefore historical. It should be deconstructed. They said, but, the history of psychology literature warns you not to talk about who a child is. And, the reason was, they said, in psychology, we talk about childhood, which is we go mostly by age. Yeah. Piaget epitomized that discourse. And then we looked at childhood as an emergent category, because childhood studies were read mostly by educationists, and that's where it found its utilitarian value. And so they were reading Vygotsky, they were reading Brunner. So they started talking about childhood as an emergent category, that how we learn all the times before we go to schools, and now we always emerge as a learner. And school is one of the institutions that contributes. Don't attribute everything to school. Yes. And then to childhood as a structural category. And this debate, when childhood as a structural category, like is there one face that we have for a child, or there are multiple faces, and do we really talk about? I thought you were talking more as childhood as a structural category. I just loved it. But this is the debate. I thought I'll tell you. If I take a historical look at psychological debates on this is where we are at the moment.
Okay. I think if you could respond to these two, even if as comments and thoughts, and then we can go on.
No, I completely agree. The gap is historians are not reading the work of psychologists. Although psychologists led the debate, especially development psychology had a huge role to play. But although now there is a field called the history of emotions, which is now drawing from psychology, neurology, and anthropology, I agree with you. I'm not surprised the students attacked you. I can see the line of thinking. But you are right. But a lot has changed because of, for example, changes in consumption styles, demography, smaller family sizes. There's also a lot of literature from psychologists itself on questions of trauma. And I think earlier I mentioned the category of teenage. Now there is a very clear, deliberate attempt to not club everybody below a certain age as children. So there is now a recognition that teenagers have specific needs and specific. So I agree with you that this debate is closely interlinked with that. And to you, sir, of course, there is no one-stop solution for ending this caste discrimination. What is different in Kerala, in my opinion, is because we are so used to hearing about overt instances of caste discrimination in other parts of the country. We hear of direct assault, direct violence in other states, that very often the average Malayali thinks caste, like you rightly said, it is camouflaged, right? Because we are looking for very physical instances of caste brutality, and which is not as frequent as it is in many parts of the state. It occurs, but not at the, like, for example, where my university is based in Uttar Pradesh. You don't see that kind of caste violence and casteism in Kerala. What has to change, of course, is new forms of social movement. I am somebody who, I do think, unless there is a active, concerted effort of civil society and new kinds of social movement and a regeneration of current political parties, caste is not going to go away. And it is not going to go away because I think we wrongly think caste is static. Caste is very resilient. Caste is also, and I think Rajesh mentioned it correctly, that colonial modernity had a role to play in modernizing caste. And one big example are Khap Panchayats in Haryana. Right? So Khap Panchayats in Haryana shouldn't really exist. They are not constitutional, but they exist alongside the constitution. And caste has taken on new forms in cities. Caste and technology has gone very well together. So if we go by a very traditional notion of caste, then I think we are really on the wrong path. Caste is very resilient. Caste morphs into new ways, and caste has a huge role to play in the transmission of English education as well. What is Indian English after all? A lot of linguists are working on Indian English and different dialects of English. And this whole mushrooming of English language schools or English coaching centers, at some point, I believe there is a underpinning of caste as well, right? Sometimes when students from subaltern backgrounds speak English, as fluent as they might be, their diction is constantly humiliated, their pronunciation is constantly humiliated, so on and so forth. So Indian English itself has a politics of its own. Yeah.
Thanks. Are there any questions or comments? I actually have one for you, Rajshri. This is in terms of what Suraj was saying in the morning, that its youth festival is going on currently, and that it's now become a whole repertoire of equities being highly inequitable because people with power, access, money, resources are bringing in elements. He said of a school that flew in a choreographer from Dubai for a fest. And I would just like to understand, since you talked about the historicity, how this is reflecting, because this is also connected to what Divya was talking about in terms of the historicity of inequities that are based. So if you could throw light on that. And are you able to unmute? Okay. Yeah, I think you're
Thank
unmuted.
you. Yeah, thank you for your question. So I see that Kalolsavam has, in a lot of ways, democratized the arts, at least the classical art forms, because you see, in the earlier times, you wouldn't have seen people from oppressed caste backgrounds teaching classical dance forms. But now we have teachers from oppressed caste backgrounds teaching students and making a living out of training students for the youth festivals. But at the same time, they don't have enough power to kind of break the system which still privileges the oppressor caste communities. And in terms of the expenses that the youth festival especially the dance competitions require students to bear. I think it's still very problematic because it costs a lot of money for students to participate in the youth festivals. For example, and also, like, the media has a role to play in sort of making students and parents spend on youth festival. Like, for instance, every year you can actually find newspaper reports of how and this is this is also valorized, like how parents take loans or sell their cows and sell whatever they own to enable the students to go and participate in the youth festival. So this is kind of valorized, and it's had an impact on the kind of expenses that parents are willing to take, and also the government is unable to kind of put a control on it. Yeah, and I think that the teachers, and since considering that the government does not invest in arts and culture elsewhere, there is an economy that, and now there's a growing economy that actually depends on the youth festival for subsistence. So if the parents stop spending money on children, these people are unable to kind of support themselves, because this is a major means of income for teachers as well.
Thanks, Rajshri. That was one. So if there are any other questions, comments, if you have, I do have more questions and comments, but I would want to give the floor to the audience. Any? Okay. I will continue with the question to Rajshri, and then, okay, there is. Yes, yeah, please. 1 second.
So when we talk about when we are a constitutional democracy. So Right to Education Act, Right for Free and Compulsory Education Act, clearly stipulates that education up to the age of 14 is right-based. And in the Central Act 29 Part 2 clearly stipulates the way a child should be treated without fear, trauma, anxiety, and discovery learning, etc. So many things that I am not repeating it. And also the classroom, a formal classroom, suppose class 1 or 2, any class. Class is the first democratic forum where one teacher teaches the same textbook, same curriculum, but different children. But is a professional teacher never takes care of where the child comes from. If she or he takes care of for the supporting the child. So in that case, these type of dynamics which over the years historically the complicated caste ancestry of our state should be legally taken care of, because in right to education I say justice be art. So I'm asking, is there such concern exists to that gravity in the ground? That's one question. To Ms. Rajeshri, see, the participants number is 15,000 in the youth festival. Roughly, we have 50 lakhs school students in the school system. And the youth festival process calls for constant preparation for about 2-3 months for the department. Then the machinery is focusing on that. Unhealthy practices are there. If, for example, I will suggest an example. When I went to a school, the children were being prepared for participating in a science mela. Only 5 children will be selected for participating in that mela. 120 children were left behind by all the teachers, and these 5 teachers in the same room were preparing the children. So this, I think, according to IEP, is it outright? Is it a matter of pride, or is it a wastage of resources and misappropriation of money or corruption, etc.? These are some of the very serious issues which Kerala should rise at the moment in terms of child rights, in terms of right to education act, etc.
Yeah, I think the question first was addressed to Divya and then to Rajshri. So have you formulated your thoughts? Yeah. Please raise your hand if you're interested in asking more questions. We'll get back.
I take it more as an observation. There's no doubt that the RT is one of the most landmark legislations in the last few decades. But unfortunately, in the last few months, we have seen a dilution of the RT, right? In the newspaper, the RT is going to lose its essence. The way it's going, educationists will agree that the RT will lose its what the initial goal with which it was democratically framed. I agree with you in essence, and I completely agree that, and I think this is where childhood studies helps give you a slightly nuanced perspective. That is, who is a child? One is what ought to be who ought to be a child, and very often legislators, teachers, adults like us, we have a very normative understanding of childhood. How should a child behave? Who ought to be a child? Who is a good teacher? And it is in that spirit legislations such as this are written. So you're right. The sections 2029 will detail, how should a teacher conduct in class. But the question is, some of these discussions are not fully fleshed out in the child rights discourse. And that is where there is a mismatch between the actual. So RT is not a child welfare centric. It's a fundamental right. And fundamental right has a very separate set of legal mechanisms for us to enforce in court, as opposed to what a Ministry of Child Welfare will do. I think the disjunct can be bridged only if we see RT as a fundamental right, but also enmeshed with the question of child welfare itself. And that would require a separate legal mechanism. And I say this because we are a country where there are not even enough children's courts. Right? Goa has one, Delhi has one, Maharashtra has one. So even for other kinds of crimes and excesses against children, there are barely any children's courts. Judges are not sensitized, lawyers are not sensitized. So when we say if a professional teacher does not conduct according to the clauses of the RTE, is it actually legally enforceable? It's legally not, it doesn't stand. You can't really enforce it unless the teacher has committed an act of brutality or discrimination or harassment, rape, crimes such as that. So I think the conversation can only be pushed forth if we are able to prevent, one, the RTE from being diluted, and two, for law itself to take into factor, like you said, if there is a transgression within the classroom, there has to be some legal redressal for the child and the parent. Just to come back, just one last point. In cultures like Asia, particularly East Asia, South Asia, and I think all of us will agree on this, I'm not saying it from my own opinion, teachers are often seen as quasi-parents. Teachers are almost like semi-parents, which is why until very recently, teachers could beat children. In many countries, the conversation have gone forward. So today, Europeans will behave as if they never beat their children. That's not true. Until 50 years ago, Americans and Europeans were beating up children in schools and at home. But the child rights conversation has moved so far, whereas it's not to say we are backward and they are forward. I'm just saying culturally, we parents in Asian countries extend parental rights to the teacher. Or like in Malayalam, we say, Kutira nalladinu vendi, for the interests of the child, in the best interests of the child. Now, that is the same language in the UNCRC, in the best interests of the child. Right? So cultures are also having certain struggles in implementing the UNCRC in full, because here a teacher can slap you and your parents will say, you must have done something bad. Right? So where do you then step in? Yeah. Unless it's an extreme case. So where do you then step in to say the professional teacher has violated the clauses of the RT? Where do you step in and say the teacher was a brutal person? The parent itself is beating the child. The parent has extended the right to the teacher to beat up the child, to punish the child. And in this complex cultural dynamics, certain clauses of the RT will be, I think, overlooked. But I think the real challenge is to safeguard the RT. For some of us young scholars, we see in the next 5 years, RT is going to really, really suffer. And that would mean really going back in time. Another 20, 30 years of the entire struggle to have RT will go back. And that in itself is going to be a big, big challenge. Yeah, Rajeshri, over to you.
Yeah, we'll unmute you.
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Hello? Yeah, okay. Yeah, so Youth Festival is actually, I think, one of the most celebrated events in Kerala by the media. If you've gone for these festivals, you would know that almost all media outlets, including television, print, and online media houses, set up stalls at venues and covering they cover all the events that happen throughout the week of the festival, and also like run special Kalolsavam issues that provide student participants to be featured in the media report. So I think there is also a growing market that surrounds the festival, which actually comes alongside this media attention that it gets year after year. So I think it feeds on this increasing competition and desire for prestige, which actually drives the parents to invest heavily in expert trainers and costumes, and like you said, like choreographers flown in from Dubai, etc. I also think, like English, there is this cultural capital that is attached to students learning the classical arts, and it has, I think, a lot to do with the fact that classical art forms are like the poster images for the poster image that represents the Malayali or the Indian national culture. So it has a lot to do with that. So the arts is becoming, the classical arts especially, is becoming like a source of cultural capital for parents to invest money in for the child's future.
Okay. Thanks, Rajshri. I have a final question. It's more a comment for both Divya and Rajshri. And this is bringing us back to the topic of English language and culture, which is primarily what we were focused upon in this whole seminar that we've had for 2 days. One thing, the sports festival really talks about competitions. And in terms of it, in culture especially, there is a lot of, as you were pointing out, the essay writing, the poster making in both Malayalam, but also in English. And there is a lot of competitive spirit to this nature, and it's a prestige for the school. It wins awards, money, it's become an economic domain. And in this, where is the right of the child in central? So I'm just trying to club the two situations to just ask you how you think that, and the National Youth Festival, I don't know, Rajshri, whether your research taps into the National Youth Festival, but Kala Utsav has now become this whole thing where colleges and schools have to shut down and not conduct but we will focus on, these wonderful festivals, which have co-curricular goals and gains, but have now become more an economic terrain. So just wondering how you're placing this, and also the aspect of global English, globalization aspects which are coming in, the culture festivals which are now using more of the dance forms which may not be more ethnic. And I liked the word that Kartika used in her presentation of replacing the IKS, the Indian knowledge system, with the indigenous knowledge system. And so how are these centered, and what does it affect in terms of the agency of the child that you were really concerned with, Divya? So if you could throw a bit of light, and we'll wind up with these last comments if there are no further questions or comments. Oh, Minati has. Yes. So please, please.
When it comes to classroom as a democratic space, and also classroom as fundamentally a violent space in our country, in all unequal societies, we are still able to handle the physical one, because we can fix, somebody harming the other person physically. But enormous amount of, this symbolic violence that is taking place, we don't know how to address that, except, doing some soft talk around it, academically and other forums. I think even minority commissions, they also go through some legal procedures to translate this into some punishable kind of language, I think now we should talk about this classroom, because all of you are talking about, is fundamentally a very, very violent space. I think that is the starting point to even talk about that space. And then we talk about, okay, how do we make it little livable? It's not a livable space. All of us, what we are, partly because of patriarchy, a lot of other things, and the classroom. And you think these bodies are less violent? They're terribly violent bodies sitting there. And classroom has produced that.
Language adds to the violence. Yeah. Yeah, Rajshri, if you could speak on this that I had started off with, yeah.
I mean, my focus, my research focuses basically on dance because of my own training and interest in dance. So I've not really looked at the literary forms, but I think the Youth Festival of Kerala is kind of projected as a site that sort of, fights the effects of globalization on children. For instance, like I think this festival is attended by Chief Minister every year, and I think the current Chief Minister Pinarayi Vijayan always focuses on this, like how the Youth Festival is a site that hasn't touched. I mean, it's a site that kind of fights the ill effects of globalization on children, and how it is a site to promote traditional art forms. So now they've included 5 Adivasi art forms in the festival, and how that will, like, inclusion of such forms will ensure its preservation and so on and so forth. So basically, Kalolsavam in Kerala at least is a site that kind of is projected as a site that fights off the effects of globalization. But as I said earlier, like the expenses that come with participating in the festival and the economy, which basically feeds on extracting money from parents. So yeah, and also like in the Kerala festivals, at least, unlike the other festivals, cinematic dance forms are banned as a means to kind of fight the ill effects of globalization on children. Is that what you asked? Does it answer your question?
To some extent, I was also looking at the fact that the youth festivals, while you focused on dance, but also the agency child, which I think Divya perhaps can answer to. I know that my cousin's children, for instance, are traumatized by this inclusion and enforcement of different indigenous dance forms. They would rather dance, for instance, and
they would rather. Sorry, I couldn't hear.
They would want to do break dance.
Break dance, yeah, that's not allowed in the youth festival. Exactly. So
why is that not allowed? And one of them was like, we will do street wars and we will do anyway, that's a different conversation. But I was looking at the fact that where is the agency of the child in all this economics? So if you could address that, Divya.
Thank you, Anisha, for asking about agency. And I think Rajeshri can also testify to this. It's been one of the biggest debates in the field and otherwise, right? Do children have agency? There is no black and white answer because they are also complex human beings. Scholars like Mona Gleason have actually said there's an agency trap. For instance, either we see children as complete victims, voiceless, silenced, they have no say in anything, or we pick certain selected stories like Greta Thunberg or Malala Yousafzai and then portray them as heroes. So children as heroic, very heroic, with from few examples, and then or they are victims. But today there is a large consensus that children's agencies are as complex as any other individual. So they negotiate, and I think the Youth Festival is a great example of that. They negotiate, they compromise, they contest, they resist, they subvert. Some of them actively participate also. They totally buy into the project also. And therefore, in the question of where is the child's agency, it is only as much as the adult will recognize it in societies such as ours. But I think it comes back to the question of the violence space. Children do exercise agency. And at least just to give you an example, because I'm more of a historian than a contemporary studies person, if you look at some of the historical data from these schools, how did children exert agency? They were extremely poor. They were orphans, they were destitute. Many of them ran away. Something that Karthika said, right? Money ran away, and that is an exercise of agency. It is negative in the eyes of the adult, running away, refusing to do the work, being indisciplined, speaking back, speaking up. These are all very, of course, they don't have long-term impact like adult actions. They don't create revolutions all of a sudden, but that does make the classroom, teachers do respond to these agentic actions. But then the question is of child rights itself, and that's a huge debate. And it's a question I leave my students with, and I leave the audience with it. If you think children are humans, then do children have human rights? Right? Really, there is a huge contradiction. If children have human rights, then they should be allowed to marry when they want to marry, which will not happen, right? So they should be allowed to not to go to school. So children are humans. All humans have human rights, but then do children have human rights? No. So there is that big dissonance in the rights-based framework, and that has historical resonances.
Yeah, so I wanted to also extend this and say that one of my chapter actually talks about the experiences of gender non-conforming children who participate in the youth festival. So many of them said that they used to actually wear the festival, the dance competitions at least is held in the binary, like girls have separate competitions and boys have separate competitions. And these gender non-conforming children actually used to participate in the costumes and in the ways that they identify themselves. So if a trans feminine person is participating in the dance competitions, she would wear female costumes and participate in the boys competition, even though they know that they'll be judged negatively for it. And yeah, so I think this is an act of them exercising their agency, where transgender students are participating in the in the identity that they assert for themselves.
And perhaps in that context, we'll go back to Rama's teachers and the students who were mixing Hindi, English, and we don't know in the future what else. I've actually had students write Hindi part of a word and English part of the word. So chalo fai. So chalo is in Hindi and fai is in English. And I challenge AI to assess all these kinds of wonderful creativities, but it does bring us back to what we started with. I think this discourse today brings us back to what we started with, where Professor Veeramani was also talking about the, and Sajita's point was also on the fact that there is a lot of economics driving education, and how do we, balance all these. All these are necessary factors, but we need to balance them and find our right way in. And yes, maybe children should not be allowed to marry when they please, but they should also perhaps not be forced to accept kisses from relatives and uncles and aunties when they say, no, we don't want. So they're taught good touch, bad touch in school. And then when you have a social event, they are like, no, you must accept the kiss of this uncle and auntie because it's necessary. So it's a very challenging, dynamic space, as pointed out. The cultures, what is culture is itself a contested space as children of this generation are dealing with. And again, how they choose to express themselves using language and languages is another point that we will have to think about. So there's a lot of thought that we will look at. But we have ended on time, and thank you very much, both the speakers. Divya, it was a wonderful presentation. I think we would have loved to see more and more pictures. It was very pictorially rich and vibrant. And Divya, Rajshri, you have really, I think, written out the script. It would be wonderful to kind of read it, because the slides kind of made us focus more on what you were speaking in terms of the thoughts. And it will be great to see these as publications that we can engage with and reflect on. I think there is an announcement before lunch that we need to, yeah. But thank you. Thanks a lot, the audience also. Yeah.
Hi. So we'll be breaking for lunch now. The lunch will be served at the same spot as yesterday. It's at the Shamiana. So you can proceed to the ground floor, cross Baker Auditorium, and there will be Shamiana. But before lunch, we'll be doing a group photograph. We'll do it at Caldor. Caldor is the amphitheater right opposite to Shamiana. So we can proceed together and get the photograph done and then proceed for lunch. And we'll resume the next session at 2 p.m. Thank you.
Thanks, Rajshri.